My first chemotherapy didn't begin the way I'd planned. There were cancelled appointments, unexpected setbacks, hidden veins, and so many moments where I wondered if everything was falling apart. Looking back now, I can see something I couldn't see then, that God had gone before me. And so if you're preparing for your first breast cancer chemotherapy, come and take your seat. This story is for you. Are you scared of leaving your children behind after a breast cancer diagnosis? Are you carrying fear, exhaustion, and that mom guilt while still pushing through every day? If you're tired of holding all of that and want simple ways to support your children and feel held in your journey and move through each day with a little more strength, you're in the right place. Hey, I'm Priska. I'm a mom of two, a woman of faith, and a breast cancer survivor. As a mom, I tried to carry it all alone, but I was never meant to. So I created this space for us. Come sit with me. You don't have to do this alone. So go grab your cup of tea. Yes, that cold cup of tea. I know you've heated it thrice already. And let's get started. Hey friend, before we get started today, I just want to say I'm really proud of you for showing up for yourself today. I know life can feel really heavy sometimes, so the fact that you pressed play, it means more than you know. And if you know someone who's going through a breast cancer diagnosis who might need to hear this episode, please do share it with them. Sometimes a simple message saying, "I thought of you when I heard this," can make someone feel a little less alone. And if this podcast has helped you or encouraged you in any way, please leave a written review too. I truly love hearing from you. And your reviews, they help other moms find this podcast. So let's get started. Hey friend, come and take your seat. I've got my cup of tea beside me and hopefully you've got yours too. Maybe you've just received that phone call that you've been dreading where someone says, "Hey, Priska, we booked your first chemo session." If that's you, I want you to know something before we begin, that I'm so glad you found this little corner of the internet that is this episode, because I remember exactly what that season felt like. Not just because I lived it, because I wrote all of it down. Most of it is written. So a little while ago, when I was preparing for this episode, I pulled one of my old journals. Its pages are a little wrinkled now. Some of the ink has faded. There are tear stains on a few pages. And as I started reading it, it was as almost that I was taken back in time. Suddenly, I wasn't sitting in my living room. I was back 5 years. I was back there again. Me, 37 years old, feeling fragile, a mom of two beautiful children, wondering, what is this, trying to understand this cancer, this treatment plan. And I realized I wasn't reading somebody else's story. I was reading mine. And as I read through those pages, I smiled, I cried, and I thanked God all over again because something struck me. You know, when I think back to my first chemo, I don't actually remember the drugs first. It's the people, the prayers, the tiny moments that happened before, but where God quietly whispered that I'm already here. And then I came across, in bold letters, I'd written in capital letters across one page, "Resilience Reborn." And at that time, I don't think I fully understood why I'd written them. But looking back now, I do. So today I'd love to tell you the story of my first chemotherapy. And not because every journey is the same, because it isn't, because your journey is going to be different, because every treatment plan is different and every woman has to walk her own road. But maybe, just maybe as you listen to my story, you'll find a little bit of courage for your own. So, the day the treatment becomes real is, the day everything changes. So the diagnosis is just no longer words. Everything has been done, and you've met the surgeon and the oncologist, and now the day is here. You've been given a date, and you're told this is the day when treatment begins. And that's when everything becomes so real, because you're no longer preparing for the treatment, you're about to walk into it. For me, my treatment was starting with chemo, because everything needed to happen fast, because it was an aggressive form of breast cancer. So the plan was to throw everything at it. So I'd have to go through three different types of chemos. And then there was going to be surgery, radiation, and then we were going to see what happens after that. And I remember hearing the treatment plan itself and thinking, that's a lot. Not because I didn't trust my doctors. I absolutely did, because I knew they were doing the absolute best. But because I couldn't imagine myself getting through all of that. And looking back now, I smile, because those words of me saying that's a lot, it's because I was trying to climb the whole mountain when God was only asking me to take the next step. I was trying to take it all with my own strength. And maybe that's where you are today. You're looking at a treatment plan of 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. And the first thing is you try to work out how you'll survive it, because that's only human. But can I tell you something? You don't have to carry the whole journey today. You only need enough strength for Tuesday. Tuesday was going to be my treatment days. Wednesday strength will arrive on Wednesday. And so something else happened. Just when you thought life couldn't be any more overwhelming, something completely unexpected happened. So we were busy trying to make plans and prepare for Tuesday when the first chemo session. So we were doing a few activities just to get ready for that season. And my husband falls and breaks his arm, like he shattered his elbow. And honestly, I remember almost laughing at God. Not because it was funny, because it felt so unbelievable. Like we're already here trying to process the cancer. We're already trying to explain things to the kids. And we're already trying to organize appointments and trying to plan for, those days after I start chemo. And now the person who was meant to be looking after me needed surgery himself. And what's interesting, his operation was booked for the exact same morning as was going to be my first chemo session. So whatever plan we thought we had was no longer going to be the plan. And I remember sitting with that, trying to be brave, trying not to let my mind spiral, but quietly thinking, Lord, this wasn't part of the plan. Have you ever noticed how life sometimes piles one hard thing on top of the other? You finally feel like you've got your breath, you're dealing with it, you're trying to come into terms with what you're dealing with, then boom, something else happens. And I've often wondered why that is. But I've realized it's usually in those moments that we discover what we are really standing on. Are we trying to stand on certainty that we can make plans? No, because certainty had disappeared. So whatever plans we'd made for after my first day of chemo, gone. Was I standing on my own strength? Definitely not, because I'd realized how fragile that was. And so the only thing that was left, it was God. And perhaps that's exactly where he wanted me all along, to just be left completely with him. So my husband breaks his arm on, I think it was a Saturday, and then the Monday was the day before chemo. And that day before chemo was one of those days that seemed to go forever. You've got so much to plan. There were so many hospital appointments. There was blood tests, more scans, like just a lot more waiting just to get ready for me to start chemo, to get ready for chemo the following day. And by this stage, they'd also discovered that my left kidney wasn't functioning properly. So along breast cancer, there was a few other tests that needed to resolve or to kind of do some first aid to allow me to go through breast cancer before then I could come back to the kidney issue. And so that day I spent so long moving from one department to another. And by the time they finally took my blood tests, it was late in the afternoon. I didn't think much of it. And, we assumed that everything would simply happen overnight, and went home, packed my chemo bag, laid out my clothes, trying to settle my mind that tomorrow chemo begins. Or so I thought. So that night, I hardly slept. Of course, it was the anxiety, not because I was in pain, but my mind just couldn't simply switch off. I kept replaying everything the doctors had said. I wondered what chemo would feel like. Will I be sick straight away? Will I lose my hair immediately? Will I still be able to be mom when I walked back through the front door the following day? There were so many unknowns. And I've realized something, that the hardest part of cancer isn't always the treatment. It's our imagination. It's the stories we tell ourselves before anything has happened. And then the morning finally came. The house was quiet. Nobody said much, because I think we were all trying to be brave for one another. Because remember, Tony needed to go in for surgery. So we got into the car while it was still early, and I dropped him early in the morning. He needed to be there by 7 o'clock that morning. And my first chemo session was booked for 11. So I drove him to the hospital and dropped him. And we didn't say much, because neither of us had imagined that this is where life would bring us. Just a few weeks earlier, we'd been planning ordinary family life, just like everyone. And now we're both heading to the same hospital as patients. So I dropped him off just before 7 and walked back to the car. He walked in with his arm in pain. I walked back, me carrying breast cancer. And I told God, just look after him today. Because even then, your heart is still worrying about everyone else. And then I drove home, got the kids ready for school, breakfast, school lunches, school uniforms, everything. Well, isn't that motherhood? That life doesn't stop because yours has. So children still need to go to school, lunches need to be packed. Someone still needs to remember they have forgotten the library book. And then cancer had entered our home, but motherhood was still asking me to show up. So I took the kids to school, dropped them, and for a moment, I just watched them, wondering how many mornings like this were still ahead of us. You wonder, will you have other mornings? Because you're just about to walk into something that you don't know, you've never been there, you don't know what that looks. And then I got back into my car, headed home and got ready for the chemo session. I remember cleaning the bathroom, just keeping everything ready, just trying to keep my head until it was time to almost head to the hospital. And just when it was about time, my phone rang. It was the hospital. And I answered. And the nurse sounded so genuinely apologetic. She explained that somebody was actually meant to reach me earlier that morning, but, hospitals are busy places and the morning rush had taken over. And by then, they were saying that, sorry, Priska, I'm sorry we can't start your chemo today. I don't even think I spoke for a few words. I just sat there. She explained that my blood results hadn't come back in time, and because I'd spent so long at the hospital the afternoon before, my blood had been taken too late. So pathology hadn't been able to process everything in time, and without those results, they couldn't safely give me chemotherapy. And so it had to be postponed to the following day, so to Wednesday. And I sat there in complete silence. So the car engine wasn't even running because I'd just gotten into the car. And I remember sitting and wondering, after weeks of preparing myself emotionally, after praying, after finally convincing myself, okay, today is the day, everything was stopped with that one phone call. And I wish I could tell you that I smiled and immediately trusted God. I didn't. I cried. it was the cry of disappointment because I felt emotionally exhausted, because I'd been gathering the courage to start treatment and it had taken everything that I had, and I was holding on to the surgery my husband was going, and now that I had to do it all over again. Have you ever noticed that sometimes disappointment isn't about what happened? It's about having to find the strength to face it again. And that's where I was. And I asked God, Lord, why today? Like, why of all these days? And looking back now, I smile when I read that prayer because I couldn't see what God was doing. I could only see the interruption. But heaven had a much bigger view than I did. While I was still in my car trying to process my cancelled chemotherapy session, my husband was receiving unexpected news too in the hospital. His surgery, it also had to be cancelled. Not because anyone had planned it, but because the equipment that needed for his operation hadn't arrived. So look at this, same hospital, 2 completely different appointments, 2 completely different departments, 2 completely different cancellations. And at that time, they both felt like bad news, another obstacle, another disappointment, another reminder that nothing seemed to be going according to plan. But God. I've come to love those 2 words, but God, because they remind me that our story never ends where our disappointment begins. So when both appointments were rescheduled, they no longer clashed. So instead of recovering somewhere from surgery elsewhere in the hospital, my husband was going to be sitting beside me during my first chemotherapy session, holding my hand and being there. Just what I had prayed for, God. So do you see it? I didn't see that at first. All I could see was cancellation. But God saw companionship because he knew how much I had prayed for that and how much I needed that. All I could see was delay. God saw provision. All I could see was another obstacle. God saw an opportunity for my husband to be exactly where I needed him most. And that day taught me something that I've never forgotten. Sometimes what looks like God saying no today, it's actually him saying, trust me, I'm rearranging things for your good. And one other thing that we reflected, so when my husband went through his surgery and when I went through chemo, I think it was for around 4 weeks or 6 weeks, we were both patients. And my husband said something that at that point also taught him to be a patient. So he was able to look after me, because he had to learn to be a patient. And he also gave us companionship at that very, he wasn't going to work, I was going to be at home. So it was time for us to be with each other. So maybe that's where you find yourself today. Maybe an appointment has changed, maybe surgery has been delayed, or maybe treatment hasn't gone the way you expected and you're wondering why everything is falling apart. Let me encourage you with something that became so real to me. A delay is not always a denial. Sometimes it's simply God moving pieces that you cannot see yet. And when I look back now, I don't remember the cancellation as the day chemo didn't happen. I remember it as the day God quietly reminded me that I've already gone before you, that I need to let go and let God. At that time, I couldn't see the picture he was painting because I was standing too close to the canvas. I was looking at the underside, but years later, I can step back and see his fingerprints all over that day. And perhaps that's why I wrote those words in my journal. Resilience reborn. Not because everything went right, but because every time something went wrong, God gave me another reason to trust him. So then Wednesday finally comes. Wednesday, the day I finally walk into that chemo room. So I walked the next morning We woke up. This time there was no phone calls, no cancellations, no unexpected changes, just quiet determination. And I remember waking up feeling different, not because I wasn't afraid. I was. But something had shifted overnight. The disappointment of the other day before had somehow settled into surrender. Like I literally surrendered everything to Jesus. I had stopped asking, Lord, why did this happen? And quietly just started praying and believing, Lord, just walk with me today. And I've learned something since then. Sometimes peace doesn't come because you have all the answers. Sometimes peace comes because you've finally stopped trying to have them. You don't have any questions. You don't have any answers. You just let go. So before we left the house, we made one more stop at the chemist. And, I can still picture us walking up and down the aisles, buying things that I never thought I'd imagine I'd need. We bought a thermometer, a soft brush, and, alcohol-free mouthwash, just all the things to stock up my chemo bag. And those little things suddenly felt incredibly important because it feels like you're shopping for a baby. And honestly, that is what it felt. When you prepare a hospital bag, you're thinking about comfort, trying to make sure that you have everything that you need. Except this time, you're not preparing for a hospital bag for a baby. You're not preparing to welcome a new life into the world. I was preparing to fight for my life. Cancer has a strange way of changing the meaning of ordinary things. Like a thermometer suddenly becomes reassurance. I needed to be checking my temperature every morning. A soft toothbrush becomes protection. A blanket becomes comfort. Things that you'd normally never think twice about suddenly become part of your survival kit. And then we went home. We got, we packed everything that we needed in my chemo bag. We got Netflix into the iPad, packed snacks, made some fresh smoothies, and then it was time to go go and get my first chemo infusion. So when we arrived at the hospital, I remember taking a deep breath. You're walking in. By then, hospitals had already started feeling very familiar. I knew corners of that hospital. And only a few weeks earlier, I'd walked in through those doors, but now they were suddenly feeling like home. But now that I was walking through when treatment was about to begin, it felt a bit different. It felt real because there was no turning back now. So I checked in and waited for my turn. And when you're sitting, I was watching other people sitting in the waiting room. Some were reading books, some were chatting away, some were quietly staring into space. And I remember wondering about all of them. What is their story? Who were they before cancer? Who was waiting for them at home? And everyone there, cancer has a way of making strangers feel connected. You don't know each other's names, but somehow you understand each other. There's some love in the suffering that you're all going through. So now it was time to get into my chemo chair. Now, that's when my veins decided to join this story. So I've got sneaky veins. Like, my veins deserve their own chapter. The nurse tried to find them. And, she'd come in, smiled, taken me through the whole procedures, and then she took my arm confidently and was ready to do the magic, get the needle stuck there, and then nothing. And then she tried again, nothing. Another nurse came, still nothing. Like, we got hot packs, nothing. Like, now everyone is around and everyone is trying to bring in their expertise. And by now I was thinking, oh my goodness, can one thing just happen the way it's supposed to happen? So, you're sitting in one of those days where every little thing seems harder than it needs to be. Then eventually another nurse came over. I called her my ninja. She was more experienced, calm, patient, and she smiled and she said, "We'll get there." And somehow we did. Years later, that's not what I actually remember. I don't remember the needle. I don't remember how many attempts it took. I just remember the people. Like, nobody became impatient. Nobody made me feel like my veins were the problem. Nobody walked away. Everyone was really rooting for me to start treatment. And every time one person reached the end of what they could do, another person stepped in. And as I was reading my journal, that really stuck me, that God didn't remove the problem. The sneaky veins were still there, but He knew how much it meant to me to start treatment and for my veins not to fail me that day, because I could not take another setback. So He simply kept sending people. And eventually, one nurse somehow got that vein. And isn't that how often God works? We pray for miracles. Sometimes He sends people. So the chemotherapy started. They did whatever they were doing already. There'd been so much drama and there was back and forth. And probably around 25 or 40 minutes, I'm thinking, okay, when is this thing gonna start? And then I realized my husband tells me, "Oh, your chemo is already running. It's 45 minutes in." And this still makes me smile. I had spent weeks imagining this enormous moment. The first drip, the first time chemo enters my body, the moment my life changed forever. And I was told it had been running already. Like, I looked at her and I said, "Really?" I hadn't even realized. Like, I'd spent so much time fearing the beginning, that first drip, that I'd completely missed when it started. And that is surreal, because how often do we suffer twice? You suffer once in your imagination, and then again in reality. And so often our imagination is far more frightening than the thing itself. And that's not to say that chemo was easy. It wasn't. There were days, very hard days ahead, like very, very hard days. But the beginning, like the first drip, the moment I'd feared for weeks, I missed it. It was not as terrifying as I'd imagined. It was like nothing. I missed that moment. Something again that happened that was so beautiful is somewhere through treatment, one nurse came and gave me a blanket, and it was part of the gifts, or some comfort they give to patients who come to start chemo with them on the first day. And it probably seemed like such a small thing, but in that moment, that blanket felt much more than a blanket. It's a blanket I still have now, and I treasure it so much, because for me it felt like God whispering, "I've got you." Because I wrapped myself and I felt like God was wrapping me. So you see, sometimes we think God only speaks through huge miracles, but He often speaks through very ordinary kindness. It's through a nurse who will smile, someone who will give you a blanket, someone who will, just hold your shoulder gently. And it's through people who probably don't even realize they're being used by God. So can you imagine how many angels we entertain even without knowing? Not, heavenly angels with wings and all, but ordinary people quietly carrying out extraordinary acts of kindness. Then when treatment finished, we drove home, and I remember feeling relieved, a little overwhelmed, but grateful. And when we walked through our front door, the kids were home. My sister-in-law was already there. My friend was already there. There was dinner already waiting by people who loved us. And I didn't have to stand in the kitchen. I didn't have to think about what to cook. I didn't have to pretend. Because I was overwhelmed, I simply sat down. And something about that still moves me, because it wasn't really about the meal. It was about what the meal represented. It said that you don't have to carry everything today. And later that evening, another friend came to visit. So as I looked around my dinner table, I realized something, that not at any point once that day had I carried the weight alone. There was someone who had been there, someone who had helped with the children, my husband who had taken me for my first chemo session, my sister-in-law who had helped with the children, my friends who had come and prepared dinner, a blanket that I'd received, and friends who had just come to sit with us. And that night, before I went to bed, I wrote in my journal, and the one sentence that I wrote was, "Today I have realized I'm surrounded by the people that I love." It was not today was easy. It wasn't today I wasn't afraid, because I was. What stayed with me was the love. And as I closed that journal, I realized something I'd not noticed before, that God had answered almost every prayer I had prayed, not by changing the circumstances, but by sending people at when I needed them, and at making me learn lessons that I needed to let go and let Him. He had sent people who carried pieces of this journey, of this big, huge, enormous journey, so that I didn't have to carry it all alone. And looking back now, I honestly believe one of the greatest gifts God gives us during suffering is each other. And so that night, after everyone had gone home, the house was quiet. Everyone had fallen asleep. The steroids were kicking in. The kids were in bed. I sat on the edge of my bed with my journal, because I write when my life feels too heavy for my heart, and I put it on papers, because sometimes I want to remember, because I don't want to forget what God has done, and sometimes because I need somewhere to leave the weight. And as I opened my journal, I started reading what I had written over the previous weeks, the diagnosis, the appointments, the tears, the prayers, the moments I wondered if I would ever feel normal again. And then my eyes stopped on something I'd written before chemo ever began. I had said, "God, please guide every step, ordain every doctor, every nurse, every caregiver, and every person who will walk this journey with me. It is not by my might, but by your strength that I will overcome." And I smiled, because I realized He had answered that prayer. Not all at once, not dramatically, but person by person, step by step, exactly as I'd asked Him to. Not the way I wanted Him to, but as I had asked Him to, He had delivered in His way. It had been the cancelled appointment, the nurse who found the veins so that I could start my treatment, the blanket that represented the wrapped love around God gives me, the friends who had come to prepare dinner, the family of friends who had been with me that first day. He had really ordained every person, just like I'd prayed. So I've realized something, that when we are living through difficult seasons, we're often looking for big miracles. We pray for the scan to change. We pray for the diagnosis to disappear. And we pray for the treatment to be cancelled, because we somehow think we'll be healed overnight. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely believe that God still performs miracle. But sometimes His miracle is His presence. Sometimes His miracle is the nurse who takes an extra 5 minutes with you. Sometimes it's the husband who is looking after you and making smoothies before dawn. Sometimes it's the friend who's leaving meals at your doorsteps. Sometimes it's that person who is doing something without asking for anything in return. And sometimes these miracles looks like people. Because looking back now, I don't remember chemo as a day filled with medicine. It was a day that was overflowing with grace. And there was also something that I found that I'd almost forgotten, because the day before chemo, I had cried a lot, because while I was sitting and just wondering, this session has been cancelled, what am I gonna do? I remember sitting there and I had found a YouTube video. It was a story of a young woman who'd been diagnosed with breast cancer just before her wedding. And she spoke with such peace, such courage, such unwavering faith. And though her journey didn't end the way many of us would have hoped, she eventually passed away. Can I tell you something? God still used her. She never met me. She never knew my name, but I know her name. But she never knew that somewhere across the world, that there was a frightened 37-year-old mom watching her story the night before chemo. Yet through her, God gave me courage. And I've often thought about that, because sometimes we wonder whether any of our suffering has any purpose. Sometimes you wonder whether our story really matters. It does. Because you never know whose faith you're strengthening, whose courage you're building, whose hope you're restoring. That young woman, her name was Jackie. That young woman became part of my story without ever knowing it. And perhaps that's what this podcast is becoming too. A place where one woman's story quietly gives another woman the courage to keep going. And there's also one sentence that I also need you to hold on to. One that I kept coming back into my journal. It was just 4 simple words. One day at a time. Not a year at a time. Not a treatment plan at a time. One day. Because that's all God ever asks us to carry. Today. And sometimes we exhaust ourselves trying to live tomorrow before we've even finished today. Because I certainly did. I wasn't just worrying about my first chemo. I was already worrying about my hair, the surgery, and everything in between. And whether the cancer would come back, or, the most important one, whether I'd see my children grow up. And I know you can relate to that one thought quickly becomes 20. And before you know it, you're carrying a whole future that hasn't even happened. But Jesus reminds us in Matthew, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I think he knew exactly how our minds work. He knew we'd want to run ahead. He knew fear likes to write stories in our mind that haven't happened yet. And so he lovingly brings us back to today. So today, stay here. I'll meet you here. So as I finished, and as I'm going to finish, looking back at the 2 words, resilience reborn, when I wrote them, I thought resilience being brave, being strong, holding everything together. Now, 5 years on, after the journey that I've been through, I don't believe that anymore. Today, I think resilience looks very different. Resilience is crying and still turning up. It's being disappointed over and over again and choosing to trust God again tomorrow. It's walking into chemo with shaky hands while believing that God is already sitting in the room waiting for you to come in. It's allowing other people to carry you when your own strength has run out. That's resilience. It's not pretending you're okay, but discovering that God is enough when you're not. And as I reflected on that whole week, I realized something that still makes me smile. That the devil, the enemy, probably thought he'd won. The cancer, the fear, the delays, the cancelled appointments, the broken bones, the veins. It all looked like chaos. He was bringing all this mishmash of chaos. But here's what he didn't know. That he didn't know that every delay would become another testimony. He didn't know that every obstacle would become another opportunity for God to reveal his faithfulness. He didn't know that cancelled appointments would place my husband beside me exactly when I needed him. He didn't know that his broken bones would teach him to be a patient so that he knew how to look after me as a patient. He didn't know that a delayed blood test would become one of the greatest reminders that God's timing is always better than mine. He didn't know that nurses, friends, family, and complete strangers would become answers to prayers I'd whispered in the quiet of my bedroom. And that's when it hit me. The devil knew my diagnosis. He knew my treatment plan. He knew every obstacle waiting for me that week. But he had absolutely no idea who my God was. Because my God had already gone ahead. He was already arranging people. He was already preparing hearts. He was already making a way before I could see it. So as we finish today, maybe you're listening today because your first chemotherapy is next Tuesday, or maybe you're counting the days and you're trying to be brave for your children and you're lying awake wondering what treatment will feel like, or you've already gone through so many obstacles. If I could sit across the table from you, I would reach over to you, I would give you a hug and I'd hold your hand and I'll tell you this. You don't have to know how you'll get through the next 6 days. 6 months or 12 months or whatever the plan is. You only need enough grace for today. God isn't asking you to be fearless. He's simply inviting you to trust him with the next step. And one day, perhaps years from now, I hope you'll pull out your journal. I hope you'll read back through the tears, the prayers, the setbacks, and the miracles you couldn't see at that time. And maybe, just maybe, you will discover what I did when I read that journal. That the moments which felt that like everything was falling apart were actually moments God was quietly building something inside of you, something stronger than fear, something deeper than courage, a faith that had been tested and God had found it faithful. So wherever today finds you, remember this. The God who called you into this journey, he will walk every single step of it with you. He goes before you, he walks beside you, and when you're too tired to keep going, he carries you. So thank you for sharing a cup of tea with me today, and thank you for letting me tell you one of my most personal stories I've ever shared. And if today you're standing where I once stood, waiting for your first chemo, I'll be praying that years from now, you'll look back and see what I can see now, that God was there all along. And until next time, there's always going to be a seat here for you, right next to me. I hope this episode held you in some small way today. And if it did, please share with a friend who needs to hear this, or maybe needs a soft place to land. And if you feel ready, please leave a written review for the podcast. I'd truly love to hear from you and to know that this show is supporting you in your journey. This space, it's not just mine, it is ours. So now go take a breath, maybe reheat that tea one more time, and I'll meet you back here for the next episode. Ciao.